Have you ever felt like someone's watching you a little too closely? Well, that's exactly what happened to me when I started building my tiny house. Everything was going according to plan until one day, out of nowhere, I got a call from the city. Turns out, someone had called in a complaint, a Karen to be exact. It wasn't just a simple complaint. They had gone as far as to alert the local authorities, raising all kinds of questions about zoning laws, permits, and whether or not my tiny house even had the right to exist in this spot. To make matters worse, I had barely started the build, and it felt like my dream was suddenly hanging by a thread. The pressure mounted, and with the city involved, I was left with two options: tear everything down or find a way to fight back. What was this Karen's issue, and what did the city have in store for me? Would I be able to prove that my tiny house was legal, or would this project come to a screeching halt before it even got off the ground? Stick around to find out how I handled the situation and whether my tiny house project was doomed before it even started. Before all this drama started, I had been planning my tiny house for months. The idea was simple: create a cozy, self-sufficient space that I could call my own without the financial burden of a traditional home. I spent hours researching zoning laws, permits, and building codes. I thought I had everything in place, but clearly I missed something. It was supposed to be a dream come true, not a nightmare. The moment I received the call from the city, I froze. The official on the other end was calm, almost too calm, as they explained that a complaint had been filed. Apparently, someone had driven by, seen the construction, and decided it was worth their time to get involved. They mentioned the possibility of fines or, worst-case scenario, having to tear everything down. But no details, just vague statements. It didn't take long to realize that this was no coincidence. This wasn't just about building codes. Whoever had called the city was determined to make sure my tiny house project never got off the ground. The more I thought about it, the more I began to suspect that there was someone out there who had something personal against my plans. But who? And why? Was it jealousy, or did they have a deeper, more malicious reason? The unanswered questions kept piling up, and I knew I had to get to the bottom of it before it was too late. As the days passed, the weight of the situation settled heavily on my shoulders. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like every move I made was being scrutinized. I started to dig into the complaint, but the more I learned, the more complicated things seemed. There was no name attached to the report, just a vague description of the illegal structure being built. That's when I began to think about my neighbors. There was Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who lived next door. She had always been polite, but she wasn't exactly the friendliest person. She had made a few passing comments about my tiny house project, nothing too direct, but enough to make me wonder. Could she have been the one to call? It wouldn't surprise me if she didn't like the idea of something new popping up in her quiet neighborhood. Then there was Rick, the guy down the street who worked for the city. He seemed nice, but there was something about his tone when I mentioned my project that made me uneasy. Could he have had something to do with this? I was starting to feel paranoid, like everyone around me might be involved. To make things worse, the city officials weren't exactly being helpful. I kept getting bounced between departments, each one giving me different answers, none of them clear. It felt like they were all waiting for me to mess up, so they could swoop in and stop the build. Every time I tried to move forward, there was another obstacle. Meanwhile, my tiny house, which had been nothing but a vision just weeks ago, now felt like a ticking time bomb. Every day it stood there, half-finished, I couldn't help but wonder if it would be the next thing to disappear. The more I tried to move forward, the more the situation seemed to spiral out of control. I started noticing strange things happening around the construction site. Tools would go missing, and things I had left out would be moved or even damaged. At first, I thought it was just bad luck or maybe someone playing pranks. But as time went on, I couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that someone was actively sabotaging my project. Then, one afternoon, it happened. I arrived at the site to find a city inspector standing by my tiny house. They didn't seem surprised to see me, but they didn't look happy either. Without a word, they handed me a notice, and just like that, I was slapped with a violation. Apparently, my project was in violation of zoning laws that I had never even heard of. According to the inspector, I was facing a serious fine, or worse, an order to dismantle the entire structure. My heart sank as I stared at the paper, the weight of the situation crushing me. But what made it worse was the smug look on the inspector's face. This wasn't just business to them. It felt personal. I couldn't help but wonder if the complaint had been orchestrated by someone who had connections or influence. Could Mrs. Jenkins have pulled some strings? Or was it Rick? Someone who might have had a vested interest in seeing me fail? Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I noticed a figure in the distance, standing quietly at the edge of the lot. It was hard to make out at first, but then it clicked. Someone was watching me. Someone who had been there for longer than I realized. My stomach turned as I began to put the pieces together. Whoever this was, they weren't done with me yet. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of the figure in the distance. The moment my eyes focused, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was Rick, the guy I had barely spoken to, the one who worked for the city. He wasn't just standing there. He was watching me, closely, like he was waiting for something. I had to take a step back. Could he have been behind the complaint all along? Or was he simply caught up in something bigger than I realized? As I took a few tentative steps toward him, Rick turned and walked away, his footsteps quick, purposeful. There was no way this was a coincidence. The pieces were starting to come together, but something about the way Rick acted felt off. It wasn't just about the zoning laws anymore. Something darker was going on, and I had no idea how deep it ran. I decided to follow him. The moment I made up my mind, my heart started pounding in my chest. I was crossing a line, snooping around on a hunch, taking risks that could get me into even more trouble with the city, but I had to know what was going on. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a simple zoning violation. Something told me that Rick, Mrs. Jenkins, and maybe even other people in the neighborhood were all somehow connected in a web of secrets I couldn't even begin to untangle. Rick led me down a quiet street, and just as I was about to approach him, I saw it. A building I had never noticed before. It wasn't much, just a small, dilapidated structure tucked away behind some trees. But as I stood there, staring at it, the sense of dread grew. This was no ordinary building. I had a feeling that whatever happened next was going to change everything. But what was I about to uncover? The question burned in my mind, unanswered, as Rick disappeared inside. I stood frozen for a moment, the tension in my chest rising as Rick disappeared into the building. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to walk away and forget this whole mess. But curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. Slowly, I made my way over to the building, trying to stay hidden in the shadows, my heart hammering in my ears. I needed to know what was going on. I reached the door and peered through a crack. What I saw made my stomach drop. Inside, Rick was talking to someone I recognized. It was Mrs. Jenkins. But it wasn't just a casual conversation. They were going through blueprints, maps of the neighborhood, and zoning regulations. My mind raced. What were they planning? My tiny house wasn't the real issue here. It was something bigger, something they didn't want anyone to know. I couldn't stay hidden much longer. I pushed the door open just a crack, enough to hear snippets of their conversation. "We'll make sure he backs down," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice low and sharp. "The city will comply. We can't let him succeed, not with that project so close to our plans." I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. This wasn't just about me. It was about control,